The high school hallways buzzed with the usual mix of excitement and teenage drama as the final bell rang, signaling the end of another day. Tommy Michaels, a 16-year-old sophomore, weaved his way through the crowd, flanked by his two best friends, Jordan and Eli. Tall and athletic, with a cocky smile that practically screamed privilege, Tommy was the kind of kid who glided through life without a care. He came from a well-off family, lived in a spacious suburban home, and had never really faced any serious hardships. To most of his classmates, Tommy was charismatic and popular, effortlessly earning the admiration of those around him. But beneath his charm, there was a cruelty that surfaced in the way he treated those he considered beneath him, people like Mr. Jenkins, the school janitor. As Tommy rounded the corner towards the main exit, his eyes landed on the familiar figure of Mr. Jenkins pushing a cart full of cleaning supplies. The man, probably in his late 50s or early 60s, wore the same navy blue work uniform every day, complete with a name tag that simply read Jenkins. His dark skin glistened with sweat as he moved methodically, wiping down lockers and sweeping up discarded trash. The students moved past him like he was invisible, another fixture of the building rather than a person. Tommy slowed his pace, nudging Jordan with his elbow. "Hey, watch this," he whispered, his voice laced with mischief. Jordan and Eli exchanged smirks, already knowing what was coming. They had seen Tommy pull stunts like this countless times before. "Yo, Jenkins," Tommy called out loud enough for the janitor to hear. Mr. Jenkins paused, straightening up slowly but didn't turn around. Tommy's grin widened. "You missed a spot," he said, pointing to a non-existent piece of trash near his feet. Mr. Jenkins glanced over his shoulder, his tired eyes briefly meeting Tommy's before shifting back to his work. He said nothing, simply bent down and continued sweeping. It was clear that he had heard Tommy's insults many times before. Jordan snickered. "Man, this guy's like a robot. Doesn't he ever say anything?" "Probably doesn't even speak English," Eli chimed in, adding fuel to the fire. Tommy felt a surge of power as they laughed together. He stepped closer, his sneakers squeaking against the polished floor. "Hey Jenkins, you deaf or something? I said you missed a spot, you better clean that up. Or what's the point of you being here?" Mr. Jenkins remained silent, his weathered hands gripping the broom a little tighter, but his face remained composed. He had mastered the art of ignoring the taunts that came his way, especially from kids like Tommy. He knew better than to react. Experience had taught him that much. Tommy, irritated by the lack of response, decided to push further. "You know, it must suck being stuck cleaning up after a bunch of high school kids all day. Like, how bad did you mess up in life to end up as the janitor here?" The words were harsh, cutting through the noise of the busy hallway. A few students nearby paused, glancing nervously at the scene. Some chuckled uncomfortably, while others shot disapproving looks in Tommy's direction. But no one stepped in. Jordan and Eli laughed harder, feeding off Tommy's energy. To them, this was just another game, a way to pass the time and feel superior. But Mr. Jenkins? He didn't flinch. He kept sweeping, his face set in a mask of calm that gave nothing away. Tommy felt a flicker of frustration. He wasn't used to people ignoring him, especially when he went out of his way to make a point. "Simon, man, say something. You just gonna stand there like a mute all day?" He pressed, stepping closer still, almost invading Mr. Jenkins' space. Finally, Mr. Jenkins paused again, but this time he straightened up fully, turning to face Tommy. For a moment, their eyes locked. Tommy's filled with the reckless arrogance of youth, and Mr. Jenkins' eyes, tired but steady, held something deeper. Something that made Tommy feel, if only for a split second, unsettled. But then, just as quickly, Mr. Jenkins turned away again, resuming his task with the same quiet focus. The moment passed, but Tommy couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. His friends didn't seem to notice, still laughing at the janitor's expense. Whatever Tommy muttered under his breath, feeling the need to move on. He didn't want to think too hard about it. "Let's get out of here." The three boys left the building, stepping into the crisp autumn air. Tommy shoved his hands into his jacket pockets, the grin slowly fading from his face. Jordan and Eli continued to joke about Mr. Jenkins as they walked, but Tommy found his mind drifting back to the janitor's face, those quiet, unreadable eyes. There was something about them that lingered, a question that Tommy couldn't quite grasp. The next morning, Tommy arrived at school, his usual swagger intact. The incident with Mr. Jenkins was already slipping from his mind as he got caught up in the usual rhythm of high school life, texting, joking with friends, and occasionally half listening in class. During lunch, as he sat with Jordan and Eli at their usual table in the cafeteria, Tommy's thoughts briefly returned to Mr. Jenkins. He watched the janitor mop the far end of the cafeteria, silently weaving between tables as students barely acknowledged his presence. Tommy's eyes narrowed slightly. He didn't understand why the man stayed so quiet. Most people would have snapped back at him by now. He'd seen it happen plenty of times with teachers and other staff. But Mr. Jenkins never did. "I wonder what his deal is," Tommy said suddenly, interrupting the conversation about an upcoming football game. "Who?" Eli asked, biting into his sandwich. "Jenkins." "The janitor guy," Tommy replied, nodding in Mr. Jenkins' direction. Jordan raised an eyebrow. "Why do you care?" "I don't," Tommy said quickly, shrugging. "It's just weird, like he never says anything. Just takes it. Kinda makes you wonder." Eli chuckled. "Maybe he's just used to it. Probably been cleaning up after punks like us his whole life." "Yeah, but you'd think he'd snap or something by now," Tommy mused, leaning back in his chair. "Nobody's that chill." Jordan smirked. "Maybe he's got some deep, dark secret. Like he's a secret agent in disguise or something." Tommy rolled his eyes, but his curiosity was piqued. There was something about Mr. Jenkins that bothered him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. He didn't like the feeling of being ignored, and Mr. Jenkins' calm demeanor only made Tommy want to push harder. As the days passed, Tommy continued his taunting, almost as if he were testing the limits of Mr. Jenkins' patience. Every time he saw the janitor in the halls, he would throw out a snide comment or make a joke at his expense. Jordan and Eli joined in, turning it into a routine part of their day. And yet, no matter what they said, Mr. Jenkins never reacted. One afternoon, as Tommy walked past the gym, he spotted Mr. Jenkins cleaning the floor near the locker rooms. A devilish grin spread across his face as he nudged Jordan, who was walking beside him. "Watch this," Tommy said, pulling out his phone. He switched the camera to video mode, zooming in on Mr. Jenkins as he worked. "Let's see if we can get him to finally snap." He approached the janitor, phone in hand, with Jordan following close behind. "Hey, Jenkins, smile for the camera," Tommy said, holding his phone up as he recorded. "You should be thanking me, man. I'm making you famous." Mr. Jenkins didn't look up, continuing to mop the floor as if he hadn't heard a word. Tommy smirked, determined to get a reaction. "What's the matter? You too proud to talk to me? Or are you just embarrassed that this is all you'll ever be, a janitor, cleaning up after people who actually matter?" The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting, but Mr. Jenkins remained as silent as ever. Jordan snickered behind him, and Tommy glanced at his phone screen, disappointed that there was still no reaction to capture. He stopped recording and slipped the phone back into his pocket, feeling a strange sense of deflation. As they walked away, Tommy couldn't help but feel a growing sense of frustration. No matter what he said, he couldn't break through the wall of silence that Mr. Jenkins had built around himself. It made Tommy uncomfortable in a way he couldn't quite explain. The days went on, and while Tommy continued to toss out the occasional insult, the thrill of it had started to fade. Mr. Jenkins' unflinching silence was starting to feel less like an act of submission and more like something deeper, something that Tommy didn't fully understand. One afternoon, as Tommy was packing up his things in the hallway after the last bell, he noticed Mr. Lewis, his history teacher, chatting with Mr. Jenkins near the lockers. The two men seemed to be having a quiet, friendly conversation, and for a moment, Tommy paused, watching them. Mr. Lewis glanced up and saw Tommy staring. He gave the boy a knowing look before turning back to Mr. Jenkins and saying something that made the janitor smile, a small, genuine smile that Tommy had never seen before. As Mr. Jenkins walked away, Mr. Lewis approached Tommy, his expression thoughtful. "You know, Tommy," Mr. Lewis said, folding his arms across his chest, "you could learn a thing or two from Mr. Jenkins." Tommy frowned, taken aback. "What do you mean?" Mr. Lewis didn't elaborate. He simply gave Tommy a pointed look and walked away, leaving the boy standing there, confused and slightly unsettled. The interaction left Tommy with an uncomfortable feeling he couldn't shake. What was there to learn from someone like Mr. Jenkins? He was just the janitor, right? But as Tommy watched Mr. Jenkins disappear down the hallway, the question lingered in his mind. For the first time, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was more to the quiet janitor than met the eye. The school buzzed with excitement as Veterans Day approached. Posters of American flags, soldiers in uniform, and reminders to honor the country's heroes lined the hallways. The annual Veterans Day Assembly was a big deal at River Heights High, a tradition that brought in special guest speakers, usually retired military personnel who shared stories of bravery, sacrifice, and service. Tommy barely paid attention to the decorations as he strolled into school on the morning of the assembly, preoccupied with more important things. He was still basking in the afterglow of last night's game, where his football team had won a decisive victory. He and his friends were the center of attention today, riding high on their athletic triumph. "Man, did you see that pass I made in the third quarter?" Tommy asked as he dropped his backpack at his locker, turning to Jordan and Eli with a smirk. They didn't stand a chance. Jordan clapped him on the back. "Yeah, bro, you were on fire. I bet the whole school's still talking about it." "Of course they are," Tommy replied, his voice dripping with arrogance. "I practically won the game single-handedly." As they chatted, a few younger students passed by, glancing at Tommy with admiration. He thrived on the attention, soaking it up like a sponge. But as his eyes scanned the hallway, they landed on Mr. Jenkins, who was methodically wiping down the lockers with a rag. Tommy's mood soured slightly at the sight of the janitor. Mr. Jenkins had become a kind of enigma for Tommy, a puzzle he couldn't solve. No matter how much he tried to provoke the man, he never got a reaction. It was like poking a brick wall, expecting it to move. "Hey, Jenkins," Tommy called out as he approached the janitor, his friends trailing behind him. "You coming to the Veterans Day Assembly later? Maybe they'll let you shine the floors while the real heroes are speaking." Jordan snickered beside him, but Eli, who usually followed along, shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Mr. Jenkins before looking away. Mr. Jenkins paused in his cleaning, glancing up at Tommy with those same calm, unreadable eyes. For a moment, the air between them felt charged, as if something unspoken lingered just beneath the surface. Tommy couldn't quite place it, but the sensation made him uneasy. "I'll be there," Mr. Jenkins said quietly, his voice deep and steady. It was the first time Tommy had heard him speak in response to one of his jabs. The simplicity of the reply, spoken without malice or anger, caught Tommy off guard. "Oh yeah," Tommy said, recovering quickly and smirking. "Gonna tell us all how to mop floors like a pro." Mr. Jenkins didn't respond this time. He simply picked up his cleaning supplies and continued down the hallway, leaving Tommy standing there, feeling a strange mixture of triumph and frustration. As the bell rang and students began filing into their homerooms, Tommy tried to brush off the interaction, but the janitor's calm demeanor stuck with him. The auditorium was packed later that morning, buzzing with the low hum of chatter as students found their seats. Teachers lined the aisles, trying to maintain order as the entire school gathered for the Veterans Day Assembly. The lights dimmed slightly as the principal, Ms. Thornton, stepped up to the podium, her voice echoing through the room. "Good morning, students," she began, her tone formal but warm. "Today we come together to honor the brave men and women who have served our country. As you know, we are privileged to have a very special guest speaker with us today. Someone who not only served with distinction in the military but also continues to serve this school community every single day." Tommy barely paid attention. He slouched in his seat, scrolling through his phone, tuning out Ms. Thornton's words. Around him, students whispered excitedly about who the guest speaker might be, while others glanced at the veterans seated in the front row. "And now it is my honor to introduce our guest speaker, Ms. Thornton continued, a note of reverence in her voice. "Please give a warm welcome to Mr. Samuel Jenkins." Tommy's head snapped up. He blinked, staring at the stage in disbelief as Mr. Jenkins, the janitor stepped forward. The room fell into a stunned silence, save for a few murmurs of confusion. Tommy could feel his heart pound in his chest as his mind raced to make sense of what he was seeing. Mr. Jenkins walked slowly to the podium, his posture straight and dignified, as if he had done this many times before. Gone was the quiet, unassuming man who cleaned the hallways. In his place stood someone different, someone who commanded the attention of everyone in the room with a calm, powerful presence. He took a deep breath before speaking, his voice resonating through the auditorium. Thank you, Ms. Thornton, and thank you all for being here today. I've had the privilege of working at this school for many years, and in that time I've gotten to know many of you, not just as students but as people. You see me every day and I see you. What you may not know, though, is that before I became a janitor, I served in the United States Army. Tommy's jaw tightened as he leaned forward, his eyes locked on Mr. Jenkins. He felt a sinking sensation in his stomach. Mr. Jenkins continued, his voice steady and unwavering. I joined the Army in 1969 when I was just a little older than most of you. It was a turbulent time in this country, and like many young men, I was drafted to serve. I was scared, more scared than I've ever been in my life. But I went, because that's what my country asked of me. And during my time in the Army, I learned things about myself that I didn't know before. I learned about courage, about sacrifice, and about what it means to truly serve. Tommy's pulse quickened. He had always thought of Mr. Jenkins as just another faceless employee, someone whose job was to be invisible. But now, as the man spoke, Tommy could feel the weight of every word. I served 2 tours in Vietnam, Mr. Jenkins said, pausing for a moment to let the words sink in. During my time there, I saw things I'll never forget. I lost friends, good men who never made it home. I earned several commendations, including a Bronze Star for bravery. But when I came home, things weren't the way I expected them to be. The auditorium was deathly quiet now, the students hanging on to every word. When I came home, Mr. Jenkins continued, his voice softening, I didn't get a hero's welcome. I didn't get parades or gratitude. Instead, I faced something I wasn't prepared for. I faced discrimination, hatred, and fear. You see, it didn't matter that I had served my country with honor. It didn't matter that I had risked my life for others. All that mattered was the color of my skin. Tommy felt his face flush with shame. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He had mocked this man, insulted him, made fun of his job without ever once considering the life he had lived. Mr. Jenkins wasn't just a janitor. He was a veteran, a hero, someone who had seen more than Tommy could ever imagine. There weren't many jobs for men like me when I came home, Mr. Jenkins said quietly. But I found work where I could. I became a janitor not because I lacked skill or ambition, but because that was the door that was open to me. And I'm proud of my work. I'm proud to serve this school, just like I served my country. Tommy's stomach twisted as Mr. Jenkins' words cut deeper. The mocking insults, the cruel jokes, all of it seemed so small and petty now, in the face of what the man had endured. Mr. Jenkins took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the room. I don't tell you this story for sympathy. I tell you this because I want you to understand something important. Each of us has a story that shapes who we are, that influences how we see the world. You may think you know someone based on what they do or what they look like. But you don't. Not really. There's always more to the story, and that's something worth remembering. Tommy's throat felt tight. His hands gripped the edge of his seat as he stared at Mr. Jenkins, his mind reeling. He had spent so much time tearing the man down, only to discover that Mr. Jenkins had more strength, more dignity than he could ever hope to have. The room erupted into applause as Mr. Jenkins stepped back from the podium, but Tommy couldn't bring himself to clap. His hands stayed frozen, his heart heavy with regret and guilt. Around him, the students cheered, but all Tommy could hear was the echo of Mr. Jenkins' words. After the assembly, Tommy stayed behind, lingering in the hallway as students streamed past him. He felt dazed, his mind replaying the scene over and over. How could he have been so blind? So cruel. He stood alone, staring down the empty hall, when he heard a familiar voice behind him. You okay? Tommy turned to see Eli, who had stayed behind as well. Unlike Jordan, who had rushed out to hang with the rest of the football team, Eli seemed quieter today, his usual carefree demeanor gone. Tommy nodded, though his throat still felt tight. Yeah, I'm fine. Eli didn't press, but Tommy could see the same guilt mirrored in his friend's eyes. They had both mocked Mr. Jenkins. They had both been part of the problem. I didn't know, Tommy said quietly, more to himself than to Eli. Me neither, Eli replied, his voice just as soft. But we do now. They stood there in silence for a moment longer, the weight of the morning settling between them. Tommy knew he had to make things right, but the thought of facing Mr. Jenkins now filled him with dread. How could he possibly apologize for everything he had said? Before Tommy could say anything else, Mr. Jenkins appeared at the far end of the hallway, pushing his cleaning cart as usual. He moved with the same quiet grace, but now Tommy saw him differently. Now he saw the hero who had lived behind the silence. Eli nudged Tommy gently. You should talk to him. Tommy nodded, but his legs felt heavy as he took the first step forward. The weight of his guilt bore down on him, but he knew he couldn't avoid this. He had to face it. As he approached, Mr. Jenkins paused, glancing up from his work. His eyes met Tommy's, and for a moment they stood in silence. Mr. Jenkins, Tommy began, his voice shaky. I didn't know. Mr. Jenkins didn't say anything at first, his gaze steady but not unkind. I'm sorry, Tommy continued, his words stumbling out in a rush. For all the things I said. For everything. I was wrong. Mr. Jenkins studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. We all make mistakes, Sonny said, his voice gentle. What matters is what you learn from them. Tommy swallowed hard, his chest tight with emotion. He wasn't sure what to say, wasn't sure if anything he said could ever make up for what he had done. But in that moment, Mr. Jenkins' calm acceptance felt like a lifeline, a chance to make things right. I'll do better, Tommy said quietly. I promise. Mr. Jenkins gave him a small, knowing smile. That's all anyone can ask. As Tommy walked away, the weight on his chest felt a little lighter. There was still a long way to go, but for the first time he felt like he was on the right path. The atmosphere in the school had shifted in the days following the Veterans Day assembly. Word about Mr. Jenkins had spread like wildfire, and almost overnight students who had once ignored him now treated him with a newfound respect. There were whispers in the hallways, conversations about his military service, and an overall sense of awe. Some students even stopped to thank him or ask him about his time in Vietnam, though Mr. Jenkins remained as humble and quiet as ever, offering only brief responses before returning to his work. For Tommy, the days that followed were filled with uncomfortable reflection. The words he had spoken to Mr. Jenkins over the years echoed in his mind, each one cutting deeper now that he knew the truth. Every insult, every joke, it all seemed so cruel and petty in light of what Mr. Jenkins had endured. Tommy had tried to apologize, but the encounter had left him feeling unsatisfied, as if words alone could never be enough to make amends for the way he had treated the janitor. Tommy couldn't escape the guilt that weighed heavily on him. Every time he saw Mr. Jenkins in the hallway, that same sinking feeling returned, gnawing at him like an open wound. He didn't know how to fix it, didn't know if it could be fixed. One afternoon, about a week after the assembly, Tommy was sitting alone in the school library, his head resting on his hand as he stared blankly at the textbook in front of him. He wasn't really studying, his mind was elsewhere, consumed by the same thoughts that had been haunting him since that day. The pages of the textbook blurred together, and he let out a frustrated sigh, slamming the book shut. Tommy. The sudden sound of his name jolted him out of his thoughts, and he looked up to see Mr. Lewis, his history teacher, standing at the end of the table. Mr. Lewis had always been one of the more laid-back teachers, known for his engaging lessons and approachable demeanor. But today his expression was serious, his eyes studying Tommy intently. Mr. Lewis, Tommy said, straightening up. Hey. Mr. Lewis pulled out a chair and sat down across from him, folding his hands on the table. You've seemed a little out of it these past few days, he said, his voice calm but probing. Everything okay? Tommy hesitated, unsure of how to respond. The truth was, everything wasn't okay, but he didn't know how to put it into words. Mr. Lewis didn't push. He simply waited, giving Tommy the space to speak. Finally, Tommy let out a heavy sigh. It's just Mr. Jenkins. Mr. Lewis nodded slowly, as if he had been expecting that. Go on. I didn't know, Tommy said, his voice low and filled with regret. I didn't know anything about him. I made fun of him, treated him like he didn't matter. And then to find out everything he's been through, everything he's done, I feel like the biggest jerk in the world." Mr. Lewis listened carefully, his eyes never leaving Tommy's. When Tommy finished, there was a long silence between them, the weight of the confession hanging in the air. "You're not the first person to underestimate Mr. Jenkins," Mr. Lewis said finally, his tone thoughtful. "A lot of people see him and only see the janitor. They don't see the man behind the uniform. And that's a mistake." Tommy nodded, swallowing hard. I don't know how to make it right." Mr. Lewis leaned back in his chair, his expression softening. "Making it right isn't always about doing something big, Tommy. Sometimes it's about the little things, the way you treat people from now on, the choices you make every day. Mr. Jenkins doesn't need you to fix the past. He just needs you to learn from it." Tommy absorbed the words in silence, his mind turning over the advice. Mr. Lewis was right, he couldn't undo the past, but he could make sure he never repeated those mistakes again. Mr. Lewis stood up, placing a reassuring hand on Tommy's shoulder. "You're a good kid, Tommy. Don't be too hard on yourself. Just keep moving forward." Tommy watched as his teacher walked away, the conversation leaving him with a sense of clarity he hadn't felt in days. The following week, Tommy made a conscious effort to change. He didn't go out of his way to avoid Mr. Jenkins anymore, and he certainly didn't throw out any more insults or jokes. Instead, he treated him with the same respect he would give anyone else. It was a small step, but it was a start. One day, Tommy found himself lingering in the hallway near the cafeteria as Mr. Jenkins mopped the floor after lunch. A few students passed by offering nods and polite greetings, but Mr. Jenkins, as usual, worked quietly, his focus on the task at hand. Tommy hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Mr. Jenkins." The janitor looked up, his expression calm as he met Tommy's eyes. Tommy shifted uncomfortably on his feet, feeling the familiar weight of guilt settle in his chest. "I know I already apologized, but I just wanted to say it again. I'm really sorry for the way I treated you. I was wrong, and I get that now." Mr. Jenkins regarded him for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then, to Tommy's surprise, a small smile tugged at the corners of the janitor's mouth. "I appreciate that, Tommy," Mr. Jenkins said quietly. "But like I told you before, what matters is what you do from here on out." Tommy nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. There was something about Mr. Jenkins' steady presence that made him feel like everything might be okay after all. "Is there anything I can do?" Tommy asked, his voice tentative. "Anything to help?" Mr. Jenkins raised an eyebrow, clearly caught off guard by the offer. "Help?" "Yeah, with the cleaning or whatever. I could grab a mop or something." For a moment, Mr. Jenkins looked as though he was about to refuse, but then a thoughtful expression crossed his face. "Well, if you're serious, there's always work to be done." Tommy's heart raced, a mix of nerves and determination fueling him. "I'm serious." Mr. Jenkins handed Tommy a mop without another word, and the two of them worked in silence for the next half hour. It wasn't glamorous work mopping floors, emptying trash cans, wiping down tables, but it felt strangely fulfilling. Tommy wasn't doing it to make himself feel better, but because it felt right. This was about more than just fixing his mistakes, it was about respect. As they worked, Tommy found himself stealing glances at Mr. Jenkins, trying to reconcile the man he was cleaning with now with the soldier he had heard about in the assembly. It was hard to imagine the two versions of him, the janitor and the war hero, existing in the same person. But the more Tommy thought about it, the more he realized that both parts were equally important. Mr. Jenkins had fought in a war, but he had also fought to live with dignity in a world that had often treated him as less than. That kind of strength was something Tommy couldn't even begin to fathom. After they finished cleaning, Mr. Jenkins leaned against his cart, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. "Not bad, Tommy," he said, a hint of amusement in his voice. "You might have a future in this line of work after all." Tommy laughed, feeling lighter than he had in days. "I think I'll stick to football for now, but thanks." Mr. Jenkins gave him a nod, his eyes twinkling with quiet understanding. "You did good today. Keep that up and you'll be just fine." As the weeks passed, Tommy's relationship with Mr. Jenkins continued to evolve. He didn't work with him every day, but from time to time Tommy would stay behind after school to lend a hand with the cleaning. The more they worked together, the more Tommy came to understand the depth of Mr. Jenkins' character. He learned little things about the man, the way he liked to listen to jazz music on his old headphones while he worked, or how he kept a small photograph of his family tucked into the front pocket of his uniform. One day, as they were finishing up in the gym, Tommy finally worked up the courage to ask a question that had been on his mind since the assembly. "Mr. Jenkins, why didn't you ever say anything? When I was being such a jerk, why didn't you tell me to stop?" Mr. Jenkins paused, setting down the broom he had been using. He looked at Tommy for a long moment before answering. "Because, son," he said quietly, "there are some battles you can't fight with words. People don't always listen when you tell them they're wrong. Sometimes they have to figure it out for themselves." Tommy nodded, absorbing the words. It was a lesson he had learned the hard way. "I'm glad you figured it out," Mr. Jenkins added, his voice kind but firm. "And remember, it's never too late to change how you see people. We all carry stories you don't know." Tommy thought about that for a long time after, realizing just how true it was. Mr. Jenkins had lived a life full of stories, some painful, some heroic, but Tommy had never taken the time to see beyond the surface. He had made assumptions based on what he saw, and those assumptions had been wrong. As the school year drew to a close, Tommy felt like a different person. He wasn't perfect, and he knew he still had a lot to learn, but he was trying. He treated people with more respect now, not just because of Mr. Jenkins, but because he understood that everyone had a story. It was a lesson that had changed him in ways he couldn't have predicted. On the last day of school, as students rushed through the hallways, eager for summer break, Tommy found himself standing in front of a new display case near the entrance of the school. Inside was a framed photograph of Mr. Jenkins, taken from his time in the military, standing proudly in his uniform. Below the photo was a plaque that read, "In honor of Samuel Jenkins, a true hero and dedicated member of the River Heights High Community. Thank you for your service." Tommy smiled to himself as he looked at the display. It wasn't flashy or elaborate, but it was a fitting tribute to a man who had given so much, both on and off the battlefield. As he turned to leave, he caught sight of Mr. Jenkins walking down the hallway, his cleaning cart in tow. For a moment their eyes met, and Tommy gave him a nod of respect. Mr. Jenkins returned the gesture with a quiet smile before continuing on his way. Tommy watched him go, feeling a sense of peace. He knew that he would never forget the lessons he had learned from Mr. Jenkins, not just about respect, but about life, strength, and the stories that we all carry with us.